Mamma's high heels came tapping down the stairs. "What is it, Emily?" "My pies!" wailed Emily. "Look!" Mamma leaned over and looked into the oven. "My land, Emily!" she exclaimed. "The crust is on top." "I put it on the bottom," said Emily. "How did it get on top?" "I don't know, but I'm sure the pies must be done." Using pot holders, Mamma lifted the pies out and set them on the table to cool. They were strange-looking pies. They had nicely browned crusts with little patches of custard showing here and there. "I can't take them to church." Emily was wilted with disappointment. "Now we'll have to miss the potluck dinner, and the minister will forget to announce about the library." Daddy came into the kitchen to examine the cooling pies. "I don't see why we can't take them to church," he said. "There's no reason why a pie can't taste just as good with the crust on top as on the bottom." "I just don't understand it," said Mamma. "It must be something about my oven." "It was my fault," confessed Emily reluctantly, and told how she had planned to surprise the congregation with light, flaky pie crust by adding a generous pinch of baking powder. She was surprised when both Mamma and Daddy thought her story was funny. "That crust is light, all right," said Daddy. "It is so light it floated right up through the custard." Mamma examined the pies more closely. "You know, the crust really does look light and flaky. All it needed was to be weighed down by a filling of apples or raisins." "Now, don't worry, Emily. We'll wrap up the pies and take them along to church. I'll unwrap them when no one is looking. There will be so many pies no one will even notice." "I'll eat 2 pieces," said Daddy loyally. And so the Bartletts set off for church with the 2 pies carefully wrapped in clean dish towels. Emily was wearing her Sunday school hat, which she did not like one bit. Grandma, who could trim such beautiful hats for ladies, had very definite ideas about what was proper for girls Emily's age. Emily longed for a hat trimmed with garlands of flowers, clouds of veiling, and maybe an ostrich plume or 2. And what did she get? A stiff, black Milan hat with a wide brim, a black ribbon hanging down the back, and an elastic under the chin to keep it on. Mamma said Emily had the most beautiful hat of any girl in Pitchfork, but Emily had a different opinion of it. It was such a problem, loving Grandma and not liking her little girl hats. Sunday school was over when the Bartletts arrived at the little white church, and all the boys and girls were out in the churchyard playing tag to stretch their legs before the service began. Emily's cousin June came running over. "Are you bringing pie?" she asked, and Emily noticed that, as usual, one of her barrettes was slipping. "Yes, June," answered Mamma. "Emily did a little baking." "What kind?" demanded June. Mamma hesitated a second. "Custard," she replied. There would probably be a dozen custard pies at the dinner. "We brought coleslaw," said June, and bounded off to try to chin herself on a branch of a locust tree whose leaves were turning yellow. "Why, there's fong quoc," observed Mamma, while Emily looked quickly off in another direction. Then she felt guilty. Fong quoc had given a whole $1 to the library. "I hope he is bringing rice," said Daddy. When Fong quoc was younger and Pitchfork was smaller, he had given a party for the whole town once a year. He served Chinese food, and Daddy had never forgotten Fong quoc's rice. Emily and Mamma carried the pies down the steps to the church basement, where some ladies were bustling about setting tables, which were boards laid over sawhorses, and measuring coffee into salt sacks to dangle inside the big granite-ware coffee pots. Mamma nodded and smiled pleasantly at everyone, and when no one was looking, she slipped the dish towels off the pies and set them on a table with the rest of the desserts. "Mamma, I don't see any of the custard pies," whispered Emily. "Don't worry, there will be," Mamma assured her. Emily was not so sure. Maybe none of the ladies of Pitchfork felt like baking custard pie today. Maybe hers would be the only ones. And June would be sure to blurt out that Emily had baked them. June was a great one for blurting things out. The church bells began to ring, and Emily thought distinctly, "Ring out, ye bells," as she had been taught at school, and filed into the church with Mama and Daddy. Emily felt proud to be sitting in the pew beside Daddy. He looked so big and handsome in his dark suit. Emily always suffered a terrible temptation in church, because the brown paint on the backs of the pews was blistered, and she longed to puncture the blisters to the gray paint underneath. She glanced down the pew, and there was her cousin June, busily puncturing the paint blisters. "Yield not to temptation," Emily told herself sternly, and tried not to squirm or think about her custard pies. Emily forgot about her pies when Mr. Bonnet, the minister, stood up and actually did announce the library from the pulpit. He gave a little talk about the good ladies who were giving so generously of their time to bring books to the people of Pitchfork, and how they would welcome donations of money and good books, and what a fine thing a library would be for the boys and girls growing up in Pitchfork. "And the boy who walks down the railroad track with his clean white flour sack," Emily added to herself. Then Mr. Bonnet began his text for the day. The miracle of the loaves and fishes. Emily enjoyed the story of Jesus feeding the multitudes with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. But as Mr. Bonnet went on and on, Emily found it difficult to sit still, and she was sure the elastic on her hat would choke her before the sermon ended. But Mr. Bonnet reminded the congregation that the people of Pitchfork should have faith. It was faith that had fed the multitudes. Emily felt squirmier and squirmier. In Pitchfork, where everything grew so readily, it was easy to have enough faith to feed the multitudes. It was harder to have faith about things like libraries, but if faith would help, Emily would have faith. She squirmed some more and caught Mama frowning at her. To keep herself still, she sat at attention the way she had learned at school. Eyes ahead, back straight, feet on the floor, hands folded, and had faith that Pitchfork would get a real library. The trouble was, the elastic on her hat was so tight. If only Grandma would let her have the kind of grown-up hat that was held on with hat pins instead of this elastic under the chin. What a relief it was to be able to stand up and sing the final hymn. "Bringing in the sheaves, bringing in the sheaves, we shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves." This was Emily's favorite hymn. When she sang it, she could just see Daddy at harvest time, striding along with sheaves of wheat in his arms. As soon as she could, Emily scampered down the steps and around the door of the church basement. By the time she got there, she had her hat off. She hung it on a hook and sidled over to the table of desserts. If there was one thing the ladies of Pitchfork were good at, it was baking. There were cakes, all kinds of cakes. Pound cake, Lady Baltimore cake, angel cake, devil food. Was it really all right to bring devil's food to church, Emily wondered? Pineapple upside-down cake with a cherry in each circle of pineapple. Walnut loaf cake, the kind without frosting. And there were pies, too. Cherry pie with a top crust made of woven strips. Apple pie. Emily could see the cinnamon through the slashes in crusts. Lemon pie with meringue and delicate peaks. blackberry pies with crimson juice oozing through the crust, and custard pies, 2 of them, Emily's. The only thing Emily could do was pretend she knew nothing about the pies and hope that June would forget them. She found a place at a bench beside Daddy at one of the long tables. Mama was busy helping some of the other ladies serve the food. June came along and plopped herself down on the bench beside Emily. "I'm hungry," June announced. "I could eat a horse." Emily felt suddenly shy when Mr. Bonnet sat down opposite her. He was such an important man, a man who could stand up in the pulpit and speak to the multitudes about the library. Whatever could she find to say to him, this man who could speak to the multitudes? The food the ladies set on the table: platters of fried chicken, bowls of chicken and dumplings, string beans that had simmered for hours with bits of bacon, huge pans of escalloped potatoes, bowls of coleslaw, the cabbage sliced thin as paper, and rice. Fong Kwok had brought a huge kettle of rice. His rice was the despair of all the ladies in Pitchfork. All their husbands asked for rice the way Fong Kwok cooked it, but no matter how hard they tried, none of the ladies could cook rice so that each grain was separate and fluffy, and there was crisp brown crust on the bottom of the kettle. The ladies of Pitchfork burned a lot of rice trying. Now Emily had another problem to take her mind off her custard pies and what to say to the minister. That was chicken. At every single Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner, family reunion, church dinner, or lodge supper, someone always served Emily and said, as if offering a great treat, "And here is a drumstick for Emily." Emily did not like drumsticks. She longed for white meat, the piece with the wishbone in it, but always it was drumsticks, drumsticks, drumsticks. Today, however, turned out to be different. A platter of chicken was passed to June, who helped herself to 2 drumsticks, before she passed the heavy platter to Emily, who had to rest it on the table. "May I help you, Emily?" asked Mr. Bonnet. "No, thank you, I can manage," said Emily, hastily, because there were still drumsticks left. She helped herself to the wishbone piece with a feeling of triumph. She would take it home to dry in the warming oven, and when it was brittle, she would use it to make a wish. She would wish for Black Beauty, because that was a little selfish wish. Faith was for big, unselfish things, like a library for the whole town. After that, things were better. Mr. Bonnet did most of the talking, so Emily did not have to worry about what to say to him. He talked about the splendid work the Ladies' Aid was doing for the church. He talked about the need for more partitions in the Sunday school room. He praised the cooking of the ladies of Pitchfork. When Emily finished her chicken, she wiped her wishbone on her napkin and slipped it inside her bloomer leg. Emily found bloomer legs handy for carrying all sorts of things: rubber balls, jacks, even a jumping rope. With Mr. Bonnet talking so much, and everyone having to stop eating to listen politely, naturally Emily's table was the last to finish. Emily looked out of the corner of her eye at the table of desserts. There was nothing left but 2 pies, Emily's custard pies. Naturally, they were left till the last. They were such peculiar-looking pies. One of the ladies was cutting them now. How perfectly dreadful! Emily wanted to crawl under the table. She was so embarrassed.